Alrighty, welcome to the session. So George Ma is a backend developer on Shopify's Rails infrastructure team. He loves improving the developer experience. Currently, he is building dependency tools for Ruby and Rails to make upgrades delightful. And he's excited to share them with you. Let's give him a warm round of applause.
Cool, we'll get started. Hello, RailsConf. So whether it's a software update on your iPhone or an app update of your favorite app, we've all experienced the ease of modern day software updates. With a simple click of a button, our devices instantly go to work, installing the latest features, security patches, and performance improvements. By the time we check back, the update is completed, providing us with a new, fresh update, all without us having to lift a thumb. Now, let's shift gears and think about a framework we all love, Rails. If you work with Rails, there's a good chance you've either upgraded a Rails app, reviewed a coworker's upgrade, or are simply curious in how upgrades can be done at scale. If you've done an upgrade in the past, you'll know that upgrading Rails isn't quite as streamlined as it could be. Why is this the case? And more importantly, how can we make Rails upgrades as smooth and effortless as our routine software updates? So in this talk, we will explore all aspects of Ruby and Rails versioning. We'll start with some context and our motivations behind improving the upgrade process. Next, I'll share how introducing an upgrade schedule relieved the unexpectedness that comes with a version update and showcase how we scaled Rails upgrades at Shopify. And lastly, I'll share how we leveraged and contributed to open source to streamline Ruby upgrades. The end goal of this talk is to equip you, the audience, with new insights and practical strategies that you can apply in your own companies or projects today. So hi, I'm George, a developer on the Rails Infra team at Shopify. A good chunk of my time here I've spent improving the developer experience of dependency upgrades. A little bit about myself. I grew up just northeast of here in the greater Toronto area, which interestingly might soon be very familiar to you if you plan on attending Rails World in September, since Toronto is the host city for that conference. If you do ever find yourself in Toronto, here are 2 quick tips to help you blend in with the locals. First tip, when pronouncing Toronto, pronounce it without the second T, just Toronto. You'll instantly get brownie points from the locals. Secondly, if you meet someone local for the first time and they say they are from Toronto, don't just assume that they're from the downtown area and a quick transit ride away. Toronto as a city is quite large, but on top of this, it's very common for people living in the suburbs surrounding the city to just say they're from Toronto for the ease of explanation, including myself. So now let's shift our focus to the main topic of today's talk, Rails upgrades. I'll begin by providing some context on Rails versioning and the Rails upgrade process so that everyone is caught up to speed, highlighting the specific aspects that could be improved and offer insights into why simplifying upgrades proved to be so invaluable to us. Let's begin. When considering any gem such as Rails, it's important to note 3 versions: major, minor, and patch versions. Major and minor versions introduce new features that may alter the public API. These upgrades could lead to deprecations, potentially causing errors in your application, if not addressed. The third number represents a patch version. These upgrades contain no API changes and are generally for bug fixes. There's a 4th version to make note of as well, which you may have seen before. This is the security patch number, and it is equally important. These version releases are generally paired with a security incident CVE. In this example, you can see how this patch contains a fix for a security vulnerability in ActionPack. So now that we're all on the same page, I'll give a quick walkthrough of a standard Rails upgrade process. A prerequisite that's highly recommended is that you want to have solid test coverage for the important parts of your application. What is considered good coverage? Obviously, we want to strive for perfection, but if you're starting off with little to no coverage, I'd recommend choosing a number, say 75%, or above, and going from there. You can use a gem called SimpleConf to analyze your test coverage, which is super easy to set up. It only takes 2 steps. You first add SimpleConf to your gem file and execute a bundle install. Next, you add the load files to the top of your test helper if you're using Minitest, or spec helper if you're using RSpec. Once this is done, running your tests will generate an HTML file that, when opened, provides a report of your test coverage. With high test coverage, after an upgrade, you can feel confident that as long as your CI passes, things will work correctly. It's still a good idea, however, to test any business logic in production post-deployment to ensure everything functions as expected. Now onto the Rails upgrade process. Starting off with a version like Rails 6.1.5, first you would update the version of Rails in your gem file to the latest patch version. You would then fix deprecations and get CI passing, and then update to the next minor version. The process for these 3 steps mirrors that of updating any gem. However, although Rails is installed like any other gem, it is upgraded like none other. After upgrading to a new major or minor version, you will need to run the bin Rails app update task. This is an interactive script provided by Rails that guides you through overriding or modifying existing Rails configuration files that may have changed between versions. This task will generate a new framework defaults file in your config folder for the major or minor version you're upgrading to. It's recommended that you uncomment each new line one by one and ship each change gradually. After all configurations have been flipped, you can bump the load defaults to the version you've upgraded to, 7.0 in this case, and remove the new framework defaults file. And if you started on a version older than 1 minor away from the latest, you would repeat these steps until you arrive at your desired Rails version. And with that, you're done. This is all the context you need to know to complete a Rails upgrade thoroughly. So these steps are front and center on the Rails guide, and likely the first search result if you were to search for Rails upgrades. So given that the upgrade process is clearly documented, all Rails apps at Shopify are upgraded correctly, right? Right? Oh, if only it were that easy. For some context, at Shopify, we have hundreds of Rails apps that are outside our core monolith. The majority being internal apps and libraries that are critical for merchants or the respective teams that they belong to. This can include Rails apps such as those that power our checkout carts, automation tools like Shopify Flow, and merchant-focused web apps such as the logo creator Hatchful and link in bio app Linkpop, just to name a few. You may have used some of these. So what is the problem then with Rails upgrades as they currently are? For our Rails 7.0 upgrades, prior to any of our investments in simplifying the upgrade process, we found that the experience of Rails upgrades left a lot to be desired. This is the thoughts of a Shopify dev after upgrading, and as you can see, not the most positive feedback. It says, overall painful process, if it's hard to read. After reviewing how the Rails 7.0 upgrades went, we saw that despite calling out the upgrade guide in the issue, 25% of all upgrades had forgotten a step, like bumping the load defaults, or made a common mistake, such as skipping over a minor version, creating more work for themselves in the long run. At its core, Rails is like any other Ruby gem. However, it is upgraded like none other. It's manual, prone to missteps, and often handled by developers for the first time in between sprint work. There are a few additional factors that make Rails upgrades difficult at scale, and that could best be explained with an analogy. So I'm going to take a quick poll here, so listen up. Raise your hand if you have ever procrastinated a Mac or Windows PC update. Nice. That's a lot of people. And the same goes for me. So you probably have never thought about it, but there are 2 main reasons behind this. The first is unexpectedness. Unless you're actively waiting for a specific version to release, usually an update notification comes out of the blue and disrupts your flow. The second is a lack of perceived benefit. Nobody really wants to save and close what they're doing to do an upgrade right away, when it's unclear what benefits there are to gain. So why do I bring this up? The psychology behind why we're so averse to operating system updates has many parallels to what a developer feels when they get hit with a Ruby or Rails upgrade in the middle of their project sprint. We have all of these procrastination reasons with operating system updates, and with them, we don't even need to lift a finger. We just click a button and Tim cooks up an upgrade for us. Ruby and Rails upgrades, in comparison, have many more steps in between. You aren't done by just clicking one button. For both upgrades, you potentially have to fix deprecations. And for Rails upgrades, there are the upgrade steps that we covered that you have to perform manually to complete. If you've done a Rails upgrade before, you'll know that the process isn't too difficult by any means. But over the course of 500 Rails repos at Shopify and the tens of thousands of Rails repos worldwide, Expecting all of these repos to follow the upgrade steps perfectly is a difficult task. The most common mistake that we saw at Shopify is there being mismatched load default versions. And as a whole, we saw that organization-wide, there were 20 different versions of Rails and 15 different versions of Ruby in production. This is unsustainable at our scale for upgrade agility, security, and developer happiness. With how things currently were, we could not guarantee that the whole company and all of the apps could upgrade to a specific version of Rails within a short timeline to make use of a new Rails feature, for example. And as we saw with the Rails 7.0 upgrade comment, the upgrade experience left a lot to be desired. At Shopify, we recognize the need for a more automated solution to streamline both Ruby and Rails upgrades. We aim to create process improvements and improve tooling to make things, 1, more predictable, and 2, more automated to finish and easier to finish completely, making it easy to not miss steps such as flipping the load defaults for Rails or forgetting to bump a version definition on the Ruby side. Simplifying the upgrade process would enable timely upgrades as well as reduce the learning curve and time investment for developers. Ultimately, this makes the process simpler for app owners to stay up to date, prevents mistakes, and makes it easier to take advantage of new Ruby and Rails features and performance improvements. Some of these new features and improvements include widget and optimizations with object shapes in Ruby 3.3, as well as the upcoming dev container generation and an official LSP in Rails 8 coming out later in this year. Now that we've identified some of the problems, let's dive into the ways we tackle them, starting off with those pesky psychological blockers. The first solution we made did not actually require any code. Instead, it just required some retrospection and a revamp of our processes. Since this approach does not require any proprietary code, it can be easily implemented in your workflow or at your company. Our solution was the introduction of an upgrade calendar at the start of 2022. This calendar gave teams an advance notice of intended upgrade dates, allowing them to weave dependency upgrades into their annual roadmaps. For example, teams had until April 1st to upgrade their app to Ruby 3.1 and until August 1st for Rails 7.0. An upgrade calendar just makes sense intuitively. Providing a consistent cadence for app owners helps to alleviate some of that unexpectedness we mentioned earlier. So what happens to apps then that are not upgraded by the deadline? Our framework for applications not upgraded by the deadline is as follows. For tier 1 and 2 apps that are central to the business, if not upgraded, they'll get escalated to the app team's VP to ensure that the work can get prioritized. For tier 3 and 4 apps that are either internal tools, experimental, or test applications, an expiry process is initiated. If they are not upgraded by the deadline after a period of time, they will be deleted. A regular upgrade schedule set up this way also offers another significant advantage. By creating a regular, consistent cadence of upgrades, this acts as a forcing function for app owners to consistently evaluate whether or not the Rails app in question really needs to exist. And if the app is no longer needed, this allows for an opportunity for that app to be archived instead. Over the last 2 Rails upgrade cycles, Rails 7.0 and Rails 7.1, the upgrade calendar led directly to the sunsetting of hundreds of apps. This results in less code to maintain overall, which is a net positive for us. This built-in reflectionary period for archival may be the strongest reason of all to implement an upgrade schedule today at your company or workflow. So far, we've shown how an upgrade calendar addressed the issue of unexpectedness while also providing the secondary benefit of giving app owners the space to consider sunsetting unused apps. To address the second psychological factor we discussed, the perceived lack of value, we made it a point to communicate to app owners the multitude of reasons for maintaining an up-to-date Rails version within the upgrade issue. This starts with the 3 S's. The first is support. There is simply no support for bugs in older unsupported versions of Rails. And by staying up to date, you're less likely to be debugging something that was fixed years ago. At a previous RailsConf, Eileen from our team put it best. If you're running on Rails 3.2, your version is 10 years old, and so are your problems. Secondly, stability. An outdated Rails version could lead to compatibility issues with new features, dependencies, or cause unexpected behavior due to deprecated logic. By keeping your Rails version current, you ensure a stable, consistent, and dependable platform for your application to run on. Next, security. Keeping Rails versions up to date ensures protection from those CVEs we talked about earlier, reduces security risks, and provides access to improved security features and tools. Currently, any app older than Rails 6.0 is unsupported from CVEs and should be updated as soon as possible. And here are some examples of potential vulnerabilities. The first is an incident in Action Pack and is an example of a cross-site scripting vulnerability which can lead to potential unauthorized access or data theft. The second is a denial of service vulnerability in Active Record that can cause a service to become unavailable for legitimate users. And last is an example in Active Support of a vulnerability of locally encrypted files, which could lead to potential data breaches. Why mention all of this? Well, as some of you may know, software vulnerabilities are sadly an inevitability in the world we live in. But by staying up to date and off of unsupported versions of Rails, you give your apps the best chance of staying secure. Lastly, keeping apps up to date is a net positive in terms of developer happiness for both new onboarding developers and established team members alike. As a developer onboarding for the first time to a new team, project, or company, imagine how nice it would be to only need a single minor version of Ruby and ensure consistency across any organization repository. Similarly, for established team members, staying up to date lessens potential upgrade frustrations. Leaving an app on an old Rails version and kicking the proverbial upgrade can down the road can lead to a buildup of issues, like dealing with many deprecations all at once when an upgrade does become necessary and is finally actioned on. And this brings us to the investments we made to scale Rails upgrades at Shopify. The introduction of an upgrade calendar addressed or alleviated the element of surprise, and also clearly highlighted to app owners why it's beneficial for all apps to be on the latest stable version of Rails. Looking back at the statistics of the Rails 7.0 upgrades, however, and seeing the high percentage of apps that either missed a step or made a common upgrade mistake, it was clear that there was still plenty of room to create tooling to make upgrades even simpler for developers. This isn't to say that tooling doesn't already exist for dependency bumps. A service that you're all likely familiar with is Dependabot. Dependabot is a great tool for security and version upgrades for most gems and dependencies. However, as you know, Rails is not upgraded like most gems. Dependabot will create pull requests to upgrade Rails, but in a somewhat naive way. It's set up like any other dependency update and does not run the app update task or bump load defaults. Therefore, with Rails specifically, Dependabot PRs on major or minor updates end up confusing app owners more than they help. We recommend app owners to disable Dependabot for making automated bumps for Rails, which you can do yourself by adding this line to your Dependabot YAML. So then, what approach did we end up taking? Well, if you take a step back and examine the upgrade steps, you'll see that it's nothing but a few steps repeated over and over. And if I know anything about developers, it's that if something looks like it can be automated, it will be attempted to be automated. The tooling that we landed on to simplify and automate the upgrade process is a gem called Rails Upgrade and a web app called SolidTrack. The Rails Upgrade gem we developed is a command line script designed to semi-automate the Rails upgrade process. When run on a Rails app, the script will determine the state of your application and execute the appropriate upgrade steps accordingly. This script is designed to be idempotent, meaning it can run on a Rails app in any state. This ensures that no steps are missed and the proper upgrade flow is followed, such as gradual version bumping without skipping over versions. The script applies a series of steps for a Rails upgrade. These are the same steps as the upgrade process we discussed earlier. Commits are made with the atomic changes at the end of each step. This process does most of the heavy lifting, culminating in the creation of a PR for user testing and review. At the bottom, you'll see an example of an easily automatable step, updating to the latest patch version. We have some logic behind the scenes, obviously, to determine what that version is so that app owners don't have to sweat the details. But that's not all the Rails upgrade script can do. As this is our own gem, we are able to add steps to further enhance or improve the upgrade process according to our needs, such as including RBI updaters, autocorrects, and using deprecation helpers built into Rails, offerings that aren't provided by Dependabot. In our case, we would first load the plugin Rails Upgrade Shopify into our CLI code with the following load plugin helper, and then call our gem normally with the added require flag. Inside the Rails Upgrade Shopify gem, this is a snippet of a custom step we run to regenerate RBI files for gems used in your application, using a gem called Tapioca. This plugin is only run after a patch or minor update, and as many apps at Shopify use Tapioca, this custom step saves developers having to update their RBI files for themselves. Additionally, you may have noticed earlier that we had a step called disallow deprecation. This step does a couple of things. Prior to updating to the next minor version, on your test and development environment, we set deprecations to raise. On your production environment, if the app has the bug snag gem installed, we will make use of an API introduced in Rails 6.1 called disallow deprecations to send any deprecations encountered in production to bugsnag. Both of these draw additional attention to any deprecations that may exist on an app and encourage devs to fix their deprecations before upgrading to the next minor version. We also have a step for auto-correcting deprecations. I won't go into too much detail about this one, as we have yet to write autocorrects for most deprecations, but in its current state, this step is able to auto-correct straightforward deprecations, such as those that require an API call to be removed or a renaming of a method. Lastly, on top of each step creating atomic commits for the actions it performs, each step will also store a title, guidance, and task list for the steps that had run. For instance, this is the code that outputs the title, guidance, and task list for the run app update step. And this is what it looks like once translated into a PR by SolidTrack, which we will cover next. As you can see, this step actually has two parts to the task list, a list before merging and a list after merging, which is representative of that step of the Rails upgrade process that we covered earlier, which has two parts. As you can see here, the step title is merged into the PR title. The guidance message and task list make up the content of the PR body, and the commit message is shown for the step is shown at the bottom. Now let's shift our focus to SolidTrack. SolidTrack is the web app for all things Rails upgrade related at Shopify. This can include things such as a dashboard for all repositories, a form to onboard your application to SolidTrack, and statistics of the Rails versions of all apps currently onboarded. GitHub action workflows are what enable those PRs we saw earlier to be created or generated. And it's these workflows that call the Rails upgrade gem. For app owners, all they have to know is that SolidTrack helps to regularly create Rails upgrades for them in place of Dependabot. Before we dive deeper, let's make sure we're all on the same page here with what GitHub action workflows are and how we utilize them within SolidTrack. GitHub actions are a configurable, automated process that will run one or more jobs. And they're defined in a YAML checked into your repository. Some of these jobs in our case revolve around the Rails upgrade gem, which you can see highlighted in red, that check out and install our gem. The GitHub action runs themselves can be accessed through clicking the action tab on our repository's homepage. And after clicking on the corresponding GitHub action run, you can see those highlighted steps we saw earlier in the workflow YAML file of checking out, installing, and running our Rails upgrade gem. Now let's bring it back to SolidTrack. How does it work behind the scenes? The process begins by onboarding your application, which is a simple form in Rails. Rails upgrade runs are then created weekly through a Sidekick job or can be manually triggered at any time through clicking the Run Rails Upgrade button. In our case, we have a weekly scheduled job that runs every Monday. Once a run is made, a GitHub action workflow will be created, as we saw earlier, and one of the jobs of this GitHub Action workflow fetches and runs the Rails upgrade gem. Any mutative changes and commits created by the Rails upgrade gem are compared to main and then applied to a branch. If changes are made, a PR will be created on that branch, just like how Dependabot creates PRs for you. The commits, guidance, and task lists that are output by our Rails upgrade gem is what is ultimately used as the body of the PRs created by SolidTrack. So how did this release all play out? All this investment into SolidTrack and the Rails upgrade tool enabled us to have a well-received announcement in January of 2023, internal announcement. With this release, we were able to upgrade more than 90 applications in the first week to Rails 7.0.8 and also prepare for the upcoming Rails 7.1 release. Rails 7.1 was released in the beginning of October during last year's Rails World, and we aim to have all apps upgraded to Rails 7.1 within 3 months. We saw steady progress through each week, and by February, we had 80% of services upgraded to Rails 7.1. For the apps that had not yet upgraded, we issued a post reminding app owners of the upcoming deadline in accordance with our upgrade calendar. Today, this percentage of upgraded apps sits at 96% for Rails 7.1. Overall, the 1-2 punch of our Rails upgrade tool and SolidTrack was incredibly successful. Whereas before we had 20 different versions of Rails in production, today our version breakdown is much more concentrated into just 2 minor versions, with 95% of all apps either up to date or on Rails Edge. So far, we've talked a lot about how we improved the Rails side of things. From how we introduced an upgrade calendar to ensure teams could better be prepared for upgrades, and how we invested in creating better tooling in the form of the Rails upgrade gem and SolidTrack to help semi-automate the upgrade process. Now we'll shift gears and discuss how we also similarly scaled Ruby upgrades here at Shopify. As mentioned earlier, alongside Rails, we maintained a similar upgrade cadence for Ruby. Since the inception of the upgrade calendar, we have kept all Ruby apps on the latest versions of Ruby for the past 2 years. As we were supporting this upgrade work, creating issues, pulling down and cloning numerous repos to investigate problems, we discovered that Ruby versions were defined in a number of places across our systems. Specifically, Ruby versions were duplicated across gem configuration files such as the Rubocop YAML, gem files, and our own internal development tooling. When there are a number of places where a Ruby version could be defined, it's very easy to forget to update one of these definitions during an upgrade, resulting in potential runtime errors. The most common oversight is for the target Ruby version defined in your Rubocop YAML to become out of sync and on a version of Ruby from the Stone Age. After we completed this investigation, noticing how easy it was for versions to get out of sync, a PR on Bundler shipped and got us very interested in standardizing all of our Ruby definitions into the ecosystem standard, the .ruby version file. Standardizing our Ruby definitions to this single file is what we ended up choosing, and we highly recommend you do the same, as it ensures consistency and makes future Ruby upgrades a breeze, as owners only need to change a single file. This journey of standardizing on the .ruby version file was not without challenges, however. This next section will highlight what those obstacles were and how we resolved them through patches in open source that you can make use of today. The first was an issue with Dependabot performing incorrect dependency resolutions when Ruby was not explicitly defined in the gem file. Previously, Dependabot only supported reading the Ruby version from the Ruby line in the gem file. So what would happen then if a Ruby version was not defined in the gem file? If a Ruby version was not defined in the gem file, Dependabot would default to the version of Ruby Dependabot itself runs on. That default version currently is Ruby 3.1.4. This normally wouldn't be a problem, but where this gets problematic is when a new Ruby version is released and a gem is not yet updated to support that newly released version. In our case, this is what happened with the Google Protobuf gem, as this gem generally takes some time to support new Ruby versions. Through our investigation, we discovered that the newest versions of Google Protobuf at the time was only compatible with versions older than Ruby 3.3. Therefore, if a repo was on Ruby 3.3 but had its Ruby definition only defined in its Ruby version file, this would cause Dependabot to resolve Protobuf to that incompatible version as it would resolve using its default Ruby 3.1.4 version. This ultimately would result in Dependabot resolving to that incompatible version of Protobuf, which would fail on CI and on developer machines, as those machines are on Ruby 3.3. To address this issue, we merged a patch to Dependabot that allows it to implicitly use the version we define in the .ruby version file, when no Ruby is defined in the gem file. Now that we solved this issue in Dependabot, we also wanted to ensure compatibility with Rubocop for when the target Ruby version line is removed. So that we're all on the same page, target Ruby version sets the version of Ruby that Rubocop will run within your repo. And this target Ruby version logic is one of the places we patched to reduce Ruby definition duplication. Before the fix we made, Rubocop already has in place logic to first read from your .ruby version file and use that version if it existed. This works well for Ruby applications, but where this could run into a problem was for Ruby gems. It's common practice for gems to have two versions defined, a development version and a minimum Ruby version for apps that use the gem. These versions are often different. A gem would define their development version in their .ruby version file and a minimum supported version in their .gem spec. Because there can be two versions defined in a gem, we needed to make sure that Rubocop uses the minimum supported Ruby version. To do this, we shipped a patch that prioritized the minimum supported Ruby version over all other sources. And with that, we solved the problems we had with Dependabot, resolving dependencies to the .ruby version file and Rubocop, targeting the minimum supported version for gems. That meant we were now good to standardize on the ecosystem standard, the .ruby version file, and clean up all other references. We're still in the process of standardizing Ruby version definitions across all our apps, but so far reception has been great, and we've had little friction in migrating both Ruby apps and gems alike to the Ruby version standard. Going forward, developers just need to change one line to upgrade their Ruby version, improving upgrade ease, version consistency, and reducing onboarding friction for new developers. So I've talked about a lot of Ruby and Rails versioning concepts in this talk. To wrap this up, I'll share how our improvements in upgrade tooling was received by the Shopify developers and recap some key takeaways. At Shopify, we have an annual developer survey. One of the questions asks, how painful is it to upgrade to a new version of Ruby or Rails? As you can see, the survey showed an overwhelmingly positive response, with 94% of participants sharing that they had little difficulty in upgrading their apps to new versions of Ruby or Rails. We'll continue chipping away at the remaining 6%. And lastly, the key takeaways. First, with upgrades, psychological blockers are real. Introducing some structure, whether that be a predictable upgrade calendar for the entire year or a reminder in advance of a new version release, any structure goes a long way. As long as expectations are set up front, upgrades can be made predictable, becoming part of a developer's routine. This makes staying up to date that much easier. Additionally, a regular upgrade schedule can also prompt app owners to consistently reflect on whether their app is actually still needed, which can result in those same apps being sunset, dead code to be removed, saving time in maintenance and money in the process. Secondly, Rails upgrades. Although the tooling we built to streamline Rails upgrades are not yet open source, I hope it was made clear how Rails upgrades are unique and should not be done hastily. Although they are unique, they are not scary by any means. And as we've seen, the steps are straightforward and you can always refer back to them in the official Rails guides. On the other hand, for Ruby upgrades, the investments we made within Dependabot and Rubocop are available for you to take advantage of if you don't already. we highly recommend you to consider standardizing on the .ruby version file today across your Ruby apps and gems. So thanks a ton for attending the talk and listening. There have been many people who have contributed to or supported the work we've done improving Ruby and Rails versioning at Shopify. These are just a couple of folks that are top of mind. And with that, that's it. Enjoy the rest of RailsConf and make sure to talk to as many people as you can. And don't forget to update your Mac.